My name is Nina Mazar, and I'm a professor in the marketing department at Prestrom. I consider myself a behavioral scientist that focuses on examining ways to help primarily individuals, but also organizations to make better decisions, increase societal welfare, and give policy recommendations.
And I'm actually not at the Questrom School, but I used to be a colleague of Nina at the Rutman School of Management at the University of Toronto. My name is Dilip Soman. I hold the Canada Research Chair at the University of Toronto. Like Nina, I'm a behavioral scientist, and like her, my interests are in helping people make better decisions for their own welfare, for societal welfare. But over the past few years, I've also been interested in developing, I guess, what I call the science of using behavioral science, which is the idea that I think we have a fantastic behavioral science that helps individuals, that should help organizations, but we just don't have a great science of how organizations should use the behavioral science. And so that's sort of been the focus of my work for the past few years.
So the main idea behind our book, Behavioral Science in the Wild, was that even though by now there are many organizations with behavioral scientists or even behavioral teams, they lack clear guidance on how to successfully translate and scale insights from either laboratory experiments or smaller pilot field studies to their specific population and needs. And this is because oftentimes published studies do not clarify all the nuances of a finding or the particular setting in which a study was run. For example, knowing that social norm interventions that state that 90% of your fellow citizens have paid their taxes on time and you are in the small minority that has not, may work well in one country and setting, but not necessarily in another. And understanding what the circumstances, where or under what conditions and why social norms are most likely to work is important. And this is where our edited book comes in. I think that practitioners will find it very useful because it contains reviews and takeaways from leading academic and practitioner authorities on what works and when to increase their chance for success.
So I'll build on that a little bit. And in fact, if I may build on the example that Nina just offered, so 90% of your fellow citizens pay taxes on time is a great message because a lot of people are doing it. But let's imagine that number was 70%. Right? And if I came to you, Shannon, and I said 70% of your fellow citizens pay taxes on time, won't you? There's two ways you could interpret it. There's a lot of people are doing it versus I'm not the only one not doing it. Right? And the context, the environment in which you're operating might put the spotlight on one of these interpretations as opposed to the other one. And this is unique to our field, the idea that little things in the environment, things that we don't think should affect your judgment and decision making, actually do. Right now, those things could be anything, whether you're making a decision online or in person, whether you are doing it alone or in the presence of other people, whether you are stressed or have plenty of time. We can go on. And I think as a result, a lot of the results in our field that are published are super interesting. I mean, we've been able to get people to save more for retirement or donate organs or act in sort of environmentally friendly ways, but they're not portable. And they're not portable because sometimes these little things in the environment are different when you try and take a finding from one domain and apply it to the other one. So I think Nina and I first learned about this very early on when she was at the University of Toronto. This is about 10 years ago, when a book called Nudge had just been published. Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein had written this book to talk about how behavioral insights can benefit individuals and organizations. And both Nina and I had been working with practitioners in government and in businesses, and we kept hearing things like, "Gosh, this is interesting, but how do we do it? Or what's the process?" And so we started on that journey. We set up a center called BEAR here at the university to help practitioners develop a framework for how to use the science. And then we got to the second stage, which is the kind of issue that I spoke about. People would say things like, "Oh, I read this study by so-and-so, which showed that just changing the framing of information got more people to behave in a certain way. We tried it and it didn't work." And when that happens, sometimes people just dismiss the science. We've seen this happening in COVID peak time periods when there's conflicting information, people just basically stop trusting the science. And so that's when really the seeds of this book started taking place, is to say, can we think of a good framework to help people not just take a published study at face value and believe that it's going to work everywhere, but can we sort of put some nuance on it? Can we talk about when it works? Can we talk about when it doesn't work, or what they should do to maximize the chances of their intervention working? So that's how this came about. And it turned out that Nina and I weren't the only two people thinking about this. We had lots of other like-minded people who joined forces, have written chapters, and collectively, I think the book paints a more realistic picture of the promise of behavioral science.
That's right. And if I may just add, to make the content of the book accessible, we have organized it basically in 3 chapters. And one is focusing on the most prominent types of interventions, such as social norms, to explain when do they work, when not, what should you consider. Another chapter is on substantive matters, such as, for example, financial decision-making or diversity and inclusion or health and well-being. So if you are a practitioner in one of these specific fields, you may want to focus particularly on those contributions. And then we also have a variety of checklists and toolkits of what to look for. I think some of the surprising insights that businesses and other organizations can take away from our book are that, one, it's often the seemingly little or trivial things that determine the success of translating and scaling an intervention. And 2, I would say that effects will oftentimes be smaller than those published, among others because there is a lot more heterogeneity, so differences between people, when you apply an intervention to an entire population than just to a small subset of participants in a study. Because the real world, or the wild, as we refer to in our book, is so much more complex than stylized or carefully and tightly controlled experiments.
Yeah, I actually think the first of those 2 is a particularly important point. A lot of people miss that. In our business schools, we teach our students to come up with the big ideas and the big initiatives and, think big and breakthrough thinking. And I think all of those are great. But the one thing I've learned, and I suspect Nina will say the same thing, is that the success or failure of big ideas are sometimes obstructed by little things. And those things could be as little as, so you have a program which requires people to call in to subscribe to something, and people don't like calling in, so they don't call in. And so you have this fantastic program that nobody, accesses. Or there are little frictions that prevent people from, claiming welfare or doing things that are in their best interest. And these are things that we don't normally think about. We think about sort of the idea that people are, motivated to do what's best for them. And even if we make it hard for them, they'll do it if the prize is big enough. Surprise, surprise. People don't behave like that. And so it's these little things. And so when I teach this stuff, I keep telling our students, think small. I think the devil is in the detail. And I think that's an important point that the book highlights. And I think, the science should highlight that it's the little things that matter. I think the biggest limitation or challenge, I think, is the idea that, we've spoken about the fact that everything is so context dependent. And it's tempting for practitioners to go what I call nudge shopping. They will look at what others have done and they'll say, so-and-so bank elsewhere had a similar problem. They changed the messaging and then they ended up with success. So let's do the same thing. And to the extent that they don't test it in their own context, to the extent that they don't make sure that the background in which the intervention was launched is the same, there are no, what these supposedly irrelevant factors that might actually change the success. So all of that due diligence needs to be done. And we know that in business, sometimes we don't have the time to do it. And so it's tempting to go to the nut store and say, let me just see what others have done. And then you end up trying stuff and it doesn't work. And then I think you lose credibility. So I think that is a real danger. Part of the challenge is that, as scientists, we do our research in universities. Our universities are set up to do research. Organizations aren't. And so little things like just collecting data, which to Nina and I is a relatively easy thing to do, becomes a bit of a challenge in an organization, or getting approvals to do it, or having the time to do it. So I think to the extent we want to push organizations to be scientific, we have to really make it easy for them to do the science, which means collecting the data. So I think that's one area we need to worry about. I think the other area to think about is it requires a certain degree of humility to fully embrace behavioral science. And by that, I mean, it is possible to do an experiment and learn that the thing that we've been doing for the past 25 years in this organization was not the best thing to do. And we didn't know that before, but now that we've tested it. So, as one of our friends, Ryan Bull at Harvard Business School keeps saying, experimentation tests the soul of a company. It's really a test of your soul, right? To the extent you're willing to open up and say, well, look, I don't know, and I'm willing to accept the fact that I could have been wrong. And that's hard. That's hard for any manager. So I think it's a combination of both sort of having the apparatus to do the science or not having the apparatus to do the science, and then just the humility that this entire approach calls for, that I think might be two big challenges for organizations to be more behaviorally informed.
I'm sure that there are many others, but those are the big ones. Especially the second one, I think, is a very important one, because experiments, they may tell you that what you have done so far wasn't the right thing. And that is also not something that organizations, I think, would like to hear necessarily, or it's very hard to face that truth sometimes, right? And as Dilip pointed out, sometimes experiments may not work out. And then understanding that there's nothing wrong with behavioral science, but it's just a particular setting where this may not be the right solution. And, but that actually does bring me to one additional point. I think it's important to understand that behavioral science is also not the only solution, and it's not the one that can solve everything, right? It's an additional tool in your toolkit. It's an important tool, and you should use it. It's available. Why not? But it can't possibly solve everything. And it's usually a combination of things, such as also potentially monetary incentives, or just making sure that there is no sludge in the system, right? So any particular things that make things harder to even function, right? So there are a lot of things that you may want to consider, and behavioral science is just one of the tools in your toolbox or toolkit.